There are women who are buried before they die, not in the ground, but in the mouths of people who have already decided who they are. Women who wake up one morning and find that the story of their life has been written by someone else, and that everyone around them has already chosen to believe it. Deborah was that kind of woman. But here is what her accusers did not understand. You cannot bury a woman who is still watching. You cannot silence a woman who is still thinking. And you cannot defeat a woman who has already decided to wait. If you love stories where the truth rises no matter how deep it is pushed, and where justice finds the ones who deserve it, stay with me until the very end. This story will not disappoint you. And if this channel speaks to your soul, subscribe to Heritage Folktales Stories. You are welcome here. Deborah and Paul had been married for 8 years. 8 years of shared meals, shared struggles, and the kind of quiet partnership that does not look like much from the outside, but holds an entire life together from within. Paul ran a small logistics company that had grown slowly but honestly over the years. Deborah managed their home and kept the books for his business. Every invoice, every contract, every client record, organized in the neat ledgers she maintained on the second shelf of the sitting room bookcase. She knew his business better than most of his staff did. The marriage was not perfect. No marriage is, but it was theirs, built with intention, and Deborah had given it everything she had. Paul's mother, Omolayo, had never fully accepted her. The reasons shifted over the years the way accusations tend to do when the real one cannot be spoken aloud. In the beginning, it was that Deborah was too quiet, too independent, not warm enough with the family. Then it became that she was too focused on the business side of things, and not focused enough on the home. Then it settled, eventually, into the permanent complaint that Omolayo delivered at every opportunity with the patience of someone who had decided it was her life's work, that Deborah did not know how to properly care for her son. Paul's sister Victoria carried the same opinion with less subtlety and more noise. And Uncle Femi, the family patriarch, simply looked at Deborah the way some men look at things that have been put in a room without being consulted about the decision. Deborah managed all of it. She greeted them warmly, she cooked when they visited, she laughed at the right moments, she sent birthday messages and attended naming ceremonies and did every small thing that keeps a family's peace intact. But she kept her eyes open. She had learned early that in a family like Paul's, the ones who smile the widest are the ones most worth watching. Dorcas arrived on a Thursday. Omolayo brought her, introduced her as a house assistant, a young woman from her hometown who needed work and a place to stay. She was perhaps 25, with a careful beauty and the kind of composure that does not belong to someone who has only just arrived somewhere. She moved through Deborah's home on that first day with a quiet confidence that made the back of Deborah's neck go still. She will help you manage everything, Omolayo said, already arranging Dorcas's bag in the guest room as though the decision had been made elsewhere. Paul works hard. His home should run smoothly. The home already runs smoothly, Mama, Deborah said. Omolayo smiled without responding. Paul said nothing. He was standing by the window in the way he sometimes stood when he wanted to be somewhere else. Present in body, absent in intention. Deborah looked at him. He looked at the window. She picked up her bag and went to the kitchen. That night, after the house was quiet, she lay on her side of the bed and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Something had entered the house today. She could not name it yet. But she had lived long enough to know that some things announce themselves not with noise, but with a shift in the air, a change in the temperature of ordinary moments. She decided to pay attention. The first weeks were unremarkable on the surface. Dorcas cooked. She cleaned. She was respectful to Deborah in the measured, practiced way of someone who has been told to be respectful. She was warmer to Paul, not dramatically, not obviously, but in the small, persistent ways that are designed not to be noticed. She remembered how he took his tea. She asked about his day with genuine seeming interest. She laughed easily at things he said that were not particularly funny. Paul, for his part, seemed lighter, more talkative at dinner, less tired in the evenings. Deborah watched this from across the table and said nothing. She told herself she was imagining things. Then, about 6 weeks after Dorcas arrived, Paul began getting headaches. Not dramatic headaches, not the kind that send a man to bed. Dull ones, persistent ones, the kind that sit behind the eyes and make a person slightly less than themselves. He attributed it to work stress. Deborah bought him medication. She adjusted his diet, reduced salt, increased water. The headaches continued. Then the fatigue arrived. He began sleeping earlier and waking unrested. He lost appetite for the food Deborah made, but not, she noticed, for what Dorcas prepared. When she mentioned this to him gently, he told her she was overthinking. She was not overthinking, but she could not yet say what she was thinking. She mentioned his symptoms to their family doctor, Dr. Adeleke, an older man who had treated Paul for years. Dr. Adeleke examined Paul, ran basic tests, and said he seemed under stress. He recommended rest and vitamins. The vitamins made no difference. By the 3rd month, Paul had lost visible weight. His energy had become a fraction of what it was. He moved through the house slowly, and there were mornings he could not get out of bed before noon. Deborah was frightened in a way she did not show, because showing fear in that house had a way of becoming someone else's weapon. She was also beginning to notice something. Paul's decline was not uniform. On days when Deborah prepared his meals entirely, the days Dorcas was away running errands or visiting relatives, Paul seemed slightly better. Not well, but better. On days when Dorcas managed the kitchen, he was worse by evening. Deborah sat with this observation for 1 week before she trusted it. Then she sat with it for another week to be certain. Then she went to the pharmacy on Oyo Road, not the one near the house, the one across town where nobody knew her face. She bought a basic water testing kit, the kind used for boreholes and wells, and she bought something else, a small journal, plain cover, no label. She began writing dates, meals, who prepared them, Paul's condition by evening. She wrote in a handwriting smaller than her usual, careful and private. She told no one. On a Saturday morning, 6 weeks after she began the journal, Paul collapsed in the bathroom. Deborah heard the sound and reached him within seconds. He was conscious but could not stand. His hands were shaking and his speech was slightly slurred. She called the ambulance herself, stayed beside him in the vehicle, and sat in the hospital corridor through the entire afternoon, while Paul was examined, observed, and eventually stabilized. The doctor said it was likely a neurological episode related to stress and possible nutritional deficiency. They wanted to run more tests. They admitted him for observation. Omolayo arrived that evening with Victoria, and the shift in the room was immediate. Omolayo pulled the attending doctor aside in a way that excluded Deborah. Victoria sat beside Paul's bed and spoke to him in the low, urgent tone of a person trying to plant a thought. When Deborah came back into the room, Victoria went quiet and looked at the wall. That night, Paul was transferred to the private ward. Deborah stayed until visiting hours ended. When she stood to leave, Omolayo spoke quietly. "He was healthy before," she said. Not loudly, not as an accusation technically, but in that particular register that women use when they want the words to land without being held responsible for throwing them. Deborah looked at her. "Good night, Mama," she said. She went home. She opened the journal. She sat at the kitchen table under the fluorescent light and read every entry from the beginning. Then she looked at the water testing kit, still unused on the shelf. She made tea she did not drink. She sat there until midnight. Paul died on a Wednesday. He had been in the hospital for 11 days. He appeared to be improving. His energy had returned slightly. His speech had cleared. Then on the 11th morning, he went into a sudden decline and was gone before noon. The doctor said cardiac arrest. Deborah received the news in the hospital corridor with both hands pressed flat against the wall behind her to keep herself standing. She did not fall. She did not make a sound. She stood there until she could breathe properly. Then she called Kola, her closest friend, and said 4 words. Paul is gone. Come. The funeral preparations happened around her. Omolayo assumed control of the house within 24 hours of Paul's death, arriving with relatives and rearranging furniture and making decisions about everything from the casket to the catering. Deborah moved through it all with the same stillness she had been practicing for years. She cooked when asked. She greeted the mourners. She wore the right black and sat in the right chair and thanked people for coming. But on the 3rd night, when the house was quieter, she went to the room where Dorcas was sleeping. Dorcas had been subdued since Paul's death, not visibly grieving but carefully contained, the way a person is contained when they are managing something internal that cannot be shown. She looked up when Deborah appeared in the doorway, and for the first time since she had arrived in the house, the composure slipped just slightly. I am sorry for your loss, Dorcas said. Deborah looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Are you? She said quietly. Then she turned and walked back down the hall. The accusations began at the burial. They did not come loudly. They came the way Omolayo had always delivered her worst things, in the soft, certain tone of a woman sharing what everyone already knows. At the graveside, surrounded by relatives who had flown in from 3 states, the story began to move through the gathering like smoke. Deborah had not been a good wife. Deborah had been difficult. Deborah had not taken proper care of Paul's health. Paul's decline had started and worsened under Deborah's watch. Who was in that kitchen every day? Who managed Paul's meals? Nobody said the word poison. They didn't need to. By the time the burial was over, the look on the faces of Paul's relatives had changed toward Deborah in a way that would not easily change back. Victoria no longer spoke to her directly. Femi, the patriarch, had gone stiff and formal. Even the neighbors, people Deborah had greeted every morning for 8 years, began to look away when she passed. Kola came to the house that evening and found Deborah sitting in the fabric room with the journal open in her lap. They are going to come for you, Kola said. I know, Deborah said. What do you need? Deborah looked at the journal. I need the autopsy done independently, not through the family, not through Dr. Adelekes, independently. You think? I have been watching for months, Deborah said. I have written everything down. I need the test to confirm what I already know. Kola looked at her for a long moment. I know someone, she said. A pathologist at the University College Hospital. He owes me a full conversation. 3 days after Paul's burial, before the family could move to have his estate discussed or any official process initiated, Deborah filed a formal request for an independent forensic autopsy. She did not tell Omolayo. She did not tell Victoria. She told no one except Kola and the pathologist. The request was granted. She handed over her journal. Every entry, every date, every observation about Paul's condition mapped against who had prepared his food. She handed over the unused water testing kit. She told the pathologist everything she had observed in careful, sequential order. Then she went home and waited. Omolayo arrived the following morning with Victoria and 2 of Paul's uncles. They sat in Deborah's sitting room with the organized energy of people who have come to conduct a proceeding. They told her it would be appropriate for her to move out of the house within the month. That as Paul's widow without children, her position in the family home was a matter that needed to be discussed. that Paul's estate, the logistics company, the accounts, the vehicles, would need to be managed by the family while things were sorted properly. Victoria said, almost gently, that Deborah should understand that people were talking. Deborah sat across from all of them. She was wearing a plain dark dress, her hands were folded in her lap, her face carried nothing they could use. "I understand," she said. "Is that all you have to say?" Omolayo asked. "For now," Deborah said. "Yes." They left frustrated. Deborah locked the door, sat down, and did not move for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and called the pathologist. "How long?" she asked. 10 days, he said. "Perhaps less." It was 8 days. Kola called her on a Tuesday morning, her voice carrying something controlled and precise. "The results are ready," she said. "You need to come now." The pathologist sat across from Deborah in his office with the reports on the desk. Between them, he was a careful man, the kind who does not offer conclusions until they are airtight. He had been in his profession for 22 years. The expression on his face was not the expression of a man about to deliver uncertainty. He told her that the toxicological analysis of Paul's tissue samples had revealed the presence of a substance, a heavy metal compound, specifically arsenic, at levels consistent with prolonged low-dose poisoning. The accumulation pattern suggested the exposure had been gradual, over a period of at least 2 to 3 months. The cardiac arrest that had ended Paul's life was a direct consequence of that accumulation reaching a critical threshold. He set the report down. "This was not natural causes," he said. "This was administered. Slowly, deliberately." Deborah pressed both hands flat on her thighs and breathed. "The journal you provided," the pathologist continued, "is a significant piece of supporting evidence. The correlation between the symptom pattern you documented and the timeline of exposure is extremely consistent." She looked at the report for a long time. Then she asked the question she needed to ask. "Is this enough to take to the police?" "Yes," he said. She did not go to Paul's family first. She went directly to the police. She brought the pathologist's reports. She brought the journal. She brought the pharmacy receipt from the water testing kit. A small thing, but it showed she had been investigating with her own resources before any accusation existed. She sat across from the detective and told the story from the beginning, from the day Dorcas arrived to the day Paul collapsed to the final 8 days of watching and waiting. The detective listened. He read the reports. He made calls. Within 24 hours, a forensic team entered the house. They searched Dorcas's room. In the space behind the drawer of the bedside cabinet, the same guest room Omolayo had furnished in a single efficient afternoon, they found a small unlabeled container. The contents tested positive for the same arsenic compound identified in Paul's autopsy. Dorcas was brought in for questioning that same afternoon. She held her composure for 2 hours. Then she broke in the particular way of someone who has been holding something unbearable and has finally been given permission to put it down. She had been in love with Paul, she said, for years. Since before his marriage. Since before Deborah. Since a time when she believed Paul had feelings for her that Omolayo had quietly encouraged and then redirected. When the marriage happened, she had been sent away. When Omolayo brought her back into the house as a maid, she understood what she was being positioned for. She had been promised that once Deborah was gone, things would be different. She had believed it. She had obtained the substance from someone she refused to name, administered it gradually in Paul's tea and in his food, and had watched him decline while telling herself it was almost over. She had not intended, she said, and her voice broke completely on this, for it to go as far as it went. The detective's face carried nothing when she finished. Dorcas was formally arrested and charged. The news reached Paul's family before the evening was over. Kola called Deborah and described what happened next the way she had seen it. Omolayo had gone completely still when she was told. Not crying, not shouting, just still. The way a person goes still when something has collapsed inside them that was load-bearing. Victoria had left the room. Femi, the patriarch who had looked through Deborah for 8 years, had sat down heavily in his chair and not spoken for a long time. It emerged in the investigation that followed that Omolayo had not known the full extent of what Dorcas intended. She had brought the young woman into the house with ambitions, to pressure Deborah out, to give Paul a reason to look elsewhere, to shift the household balance. But she had not asked what Dorcas was capable of. She had handed someone access to a son's kitchen and his food and his daily life without asking the most important question. That weight settled over her and did not lift. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Deborah's life. Grief is not straightforward. It does not wait for justice to be served before it arrives. She missed Paul in ways that had nothing to do with the investigation. The specific sound of his voice when he was tired, the way he held a cup, the ordinary texture of a life they had built together that was now simply gone. She cried for all of it, alone, at night, in the fabric room where she had kept her journal, in the kitchen where she had made tea for a man who was already being slowly taken from her. Kola came every day. Some days they talked, some days they simply sat together, which is sometimes the greater kindness. 6 weeks after Dorcas's arrest, Omolayo came to the house. She stood at the gate for a long moment before Deborah opened it. She was alone. She was not carrying anything, and she had not called ahead, which told Deborah that she had stood at the gate because she was not certain she would be let in if she announced herself. Deborah opened the gate. They sat in the sitting room. The same sitting room where Dorcas had first been introduced. Relaxed and settled in Deborah's sofa, shoes still on, assessing the room with quiet ownership. Omolayo looked at the room and then looked at her hands. She did not have a speech prepared. There was no organized sequence of words that could carry what she had brought here. She had brought instead herself, diminished and present, and unable to look away from what she had participated in, even unknowingly, even without the final intention. I brought her here, she said. Just that. Just the plain truth of it. Deborah looked at her for a long time. Yes, she said. You did. Omolayo's hands pressed flat on her knees. I treated you like you were the problem. For years. I treated you like you were everything that was wrong with my son's life. She paused. And you were the only one who was actually trying to protect him. The room was quiet. I know, Deborah said. I cannot ask you to forgive me today, Omolayo said. I am not ready to ask for something I haven't earned. I just needed you to know that I understand now what I did and what it cost. Deborah looked at the woman who had made her life small, who had looked through her at family gatherings, who had filled her home with someone who would ultimately become her husband's killer. She looked at her a long time. Then she stood up and went to the kitchen. She came back with 2 cups of tea and set one on the table in front of Omolayo. Omolayo stared at the cup. When she looked up, her eyes were full. Drink your tea, Mama, Deborah said quietly. We will talk. The trial lasted for months. Dorcas was convicted of murder by poisoning and sentenced to 22 years. The forensic evidence, the autopsy report, the journal Deborah had kept, the substance found in her room, left no space for another conclusion. The judge read the verdict in a courtroom packed with faces Deborah recognized. Family members, neighbors, people who had looked away from her in the months after Paul's death. She sat in the courtroom with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, the way she had sat in every difficult room for the past 8 years. When the verdict was read, she did not celebrate. She did not look around the room to find the faces that had doubted her. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she stood up and walked out of the courtroom into the late afternoon light. Kola was waiting outside. She fell into Deborah's arms and held on, and Deborah let herself be held for a long time. Long enough to feel the weight of everything she had been carrying. Finally shift, not disappear, but settle into something she could carry forward rather than something that was pinning her in place. A year later, Deborah was still in the house. Paul's estate had been settled legally and properly, with the logistics company placed under her management. She knew the books better than anyone, and two of Paul's senior staff had told the family estate lawyer as much. Victoria had returned cautiously, with the careful posture of a person who is not sure of their welcome, but is trying anyway. Deborah had let her back in. Not easily, not without conditions, but she had let her in. Femi, the patriarch, had sent a formal letter through his lawyer, a stiff, legal-toned document that was nonetheless the most vulnerable thing the old man had ever produced. It acknowledged that Deborah had been treated unjustly. It stated that the family accepted the findings of the court. It ended with a single line in his own handwriting. "You were right to hold your ground." She read it twice. Then she put it in the fabric box where the journal had been. She still missed Paul. She expected she always would. Grief does not have an end, only a shape. And over time, she was learning the shape of hers, learning to live around it rather than against it. But she was still standing. She was still standing because she had watched carefully when others looked away, because she had written things down when others relied on memory, because she had gone to the right doctor at the right time rather than waiting for justice to arrive on its own schedule. She had not survived by being the loudest person in the room. She had survived by being the most awake. The loudest accusation is not always the true one. The quietest witness is not always the weak one. Patience is not the absence of power. It is power waiting for the right moment to be undeniable. What part of Deborah's story stayed with you the most? Was it her silence while everyone accused her, the journal she kept, or the cup of tea she poured at the end? And what do you think the family should have asked themselves before bringing Dorcas into that home? Tell us where you are watching from in the comments. These stories travel far, and we love knowing where they land. If stories like this speak to you, where the truth rises and the ones they underestimated are finally seen, you are welcome here. Subscribe to Heritage Folktales Stories. There is always another story waiting for you. Thank you for watching.